Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United Nations European Headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm Karen Nate Sekiguchi, and I'm with the Department of Communications for the International Labor Organization. We're here at the 106th International Labor Conference in Geneva, where over 6,000 delegates from all over the world have gathered to discuss, debate, and decide labor standards for issues in the world of work. So one of those issues is gender equality in the workplace. And I'm joined by two ILO experts who are going to talk to us about their new report on the global trends affecting women in the world of work. This is Stephen Tobin, who is the team leader for the Labor Market Trends and Policy Evaluation Unit. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Karen.
Okay, and this is Sheena Yoon, who is an economist in the Labor Market Trends and Policy Evaluation Unit.
Thank you for
Welcome,
having me.
Sheena. Thanks for joining us. Now, first of all, I'd like to invite all of our viewers who are joining us on Facebook to send in your questions, post your questions and your comments so that you can have a chance to ask your questions to these two experts, and we'll try to get in as many of them as we can. Okay, so just to set the scene, we've just wrapped up a global summit on how to ensure a better future for women at work. And we've heard from all sorts of world leaders, and in fact I have one of them for you to listen to right now. This was the Prime Minister of Canada who gave us these inspiring words.
Hello everyone. Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à la 106e session de la Conférence internationale du travail. Je tiens à remercier tous ceux qui sont présents aujourd'hui pour le travail que vous faites à chaque jour. Au Canada, nous sommes fiers de ce que nous faisons pour soutenir les travailleurs partout. Nous ratifions la Convention 98 de l'Organisation internationale du travail parce qu'il est temps de reconnaître le droit des travailleurs à la négociation collective. Et nous ouvrons la voie à l'autonomisation des femmes dans le milieu du travail. Nous investissons en vue d'aider les parents à retourner au travail ou aux études et nous nous engageons également envers les lois relatives à l'équité salariale. We're also excited that the ILO is working to develop a new international standard to address violence and harassment in the world of work. For we need to do more to make sure the rights of workers everywhere are fully respected, especially the rights of women. We are stronger when women realize their full potential, and we all benefit when women participate fully in our economy. So thank you for your commitment to women's rights at work. Together, we'll build a future where gender equality is a reality in the workplace and beyond. Thank you. Merci.
A world where gender equality is a reality in the workplace and beyond. Very inspiring words from the Prime Minister of Canada. Steve, Sheena, can you tell us where we stand in terms of that reality? Your new report, The World Employment and Social Outlook for Women 2017, talks about gender gaps and how one of the most pressing challenges in the world of work are those gaps. It really digs down into the data. So where are these gaps?
Absolutely. Globally, we see that even in accessing the labor market, there is a gap in labor force participation between men and women, about 27 percentage points. And even when women are in the labor force, they also face a gap in unemployment. Women are globally unemployed about a little over 6%. And even when they are employed, they also face poor working conditions, such as being unequally paid. Poor working contracts, being more overrepresented as contributing family workers, vulnerable forms of employment. But also these gaps are exacerbated depending on the regions as well. We see that the gaps are even wider in certain regions such as Northern Africa, the Arab states, and Southern Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, just to follow up, I think one of the things I think Sheena touches upon really is that, there's this sort of these barriers tend to multiply themselves. So because women have difficulty accessing certain occupations or certain types of good quality employment, this also explains really why in some cases the participation rates are also low. So, it really speaks to this idea or notion that, look, women are having trouble accessing the labor market. When they're there, they have more difficulty finding a job. when they do succeed in finding an employment, it's often one which is of lower quality than that of men, and this all sort of reinforces itself.
The Director General today, when during the summit, said that actually the rate of closing of these gaps is almost glacial.
Yeah.
I mean, that points to a lot of constraints around these gaps. And your new report comes with a pretty startling headline. It says closing the gaps by, now I hope I get these figures, I'm not a figure person, but something like 25% could add almost $6 trillion to the global economy. Can you sort of parse that out for us?
Sure. I mean, the 25 by 25 essentially is a goal that was set by the G20 nations in 2014 in Australia.
Okay.
So, I mean, put sort of very simply, if the current gap is, let's say, 10 percentage points, or at the global level it's 27 percentage points, as Sheena mentioned, what the G20 nations established was to cut that gap by a half.
Okay.
So really it's, cutting it by 7 percentage points or so, which in our view is really, it's a modest goal. And so in order to try to at least to measure what we think could be the potential economic impact of closing that gap, we took the G20 goal and we applied it to all nations.
Okay.
And so by doing that, it would add over 200 million women to the labor force, which is a staggering figure, and it's certainly an important notion and idea, especially in the context of slowing labor force growth, population aging. And, we make a few assumptions, but basically if we can get 200 some million of these women into work, even if we assume that their quality of employment is the same as it is today, so lower of men, it could add in terms of economic benefits some $6 trillion.
Okay, but I mean, you're talking about adding 200 million women into the workforce, and already it seems a struggle to find enough jobs out there already. Wouldn't this actually take jobs away from other people?
No, and that's a concern we often hear, and this is not a concern which is necessarily specific to women. It's something we hear quite often about migrants. But I think there's a few things we need to keep in mind. The first is that we're not talking about adding the 200 million women tomorrow.
Right.
We're talking about adding the 200 million over a 9-10 year period. We're certainly not talking about adding 200 million in one particular place. This is a global figure.
Sure.
The other thing I would say is that we have evidence from the past, which the short answer is no. That women entering the labor force will not take away jobs from other people. And the economic theory also supports this. So the notion that there is a fixed number of jobs in the economy is just not true. If anything, by encouraging women to get into the labor force, looking for work, this can have important spillover effects on economic activity. And I'm thinking really, showing my age maybe a little bit here, but certainly in the 1990s in Europe, my home country, Canada, of course, United States, there was a push really to promote early retirement schemes for older people,
Right. Yeah.
with this notion that it would solve the youth employment crisis of the time. So this idea that we would free up employment places, so the idea that there is a fixed number.
Right. Yeah.
But
And
the
then one
reality,
slots into the other.
exactly,
naturally,
but these schemes failed miserably.
They failed.
Across the board. And what we found instead was that we lost this human capital that the older workers had that was very difficult to reverse. And so the short answer is no. If anything, bringing women into the labor force, many of whom have high skills, high education, can really bring an important boost to economic growth at a time when, in fact, growth is slow.
Absolutely, absolutely. For those of you just joining us, we're live from the International Labor Conference in Geneva, Switzerland, and we're talking about the global trends affecting women in the world of work. Our guests are Stephen Tobin, Sheena Yun, ILO economists who have just issued a new report on those trends, and we'd like you to send in your questions on Facebook so we can ask them as well. I want to go into this labor market participation. With so much to gain for women and for families, for communities, what exactly is keeping women out of the labor market? I mean, we were touching earlier on constraints, but why do they have such low participation rates compared to men? Don't they want to be in work?
Oh, absolutely. We see even despite the labor market status of women, the majority of women would prefer to have a paid job.
How do you know that? How do you know
there
that?
is the recent Gallup survey, there was a result where about 58% of women who were outside of the labor force preferred to have a paid job. In total, it was 70%. So clearly, most women want to have a paid job, but there are structural constraints in the labor market, as well as constraints regarding social norms that are...
I'm going to stop you just for a second. Okay, you're going into your economist talk with your structural constraints.
Right.
What are the structural constraints?
I mean, structural constraints can vary from the absence of discrimination laws to limited access to the right education and skills that women need to enter occupations that are gender neutral. You know, they're not put into occupations that are seen as just feminine or which tend to be or has, you know, statistically it's shown to be lower paid. With poor working conditions.
So actually, what are you saying, that we should try to convince countries to make a concerted effort to increase, to make sure women get into the labor force? I mean, how can we do that? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the evidence is clear that there are clear economic gains of just making minimal improvements in the gender gap, and two, there are so many gains to be had with women's personal welfare because they prefer to work, as well as these are productive members of society that aren't contributing to the country, and if they were, there could be, you know, multiple impacts in terms of their households. There's an intergenerational effect in terms of the kids they raise, health.
But I think, I mean, just to re-emphasize, I think the evidence that comes from the joint ILO Gallup surveys, I think far too often we came to believe that we had opened up and created an enabling environment for all of the women who wanted to participate could therefore do so. And that's just not true. So, you know, 58%, so, I mean, close to 60% of women who are outside of the labor market would prefer to have a paid job.
Right.
So, I mean, that means that this environment we thought we had created that would enable women to fulfill their aspirations just isn't true. And I think we need to do more.
But how do you create that environment? Isn't that going to cost money?
Certainly it will cost money, and some of the things we've been talking about, whether or not it's promotional campaigns to combat discrimination or ensuring that there is affordable care or adequate maternity and parental leave, these things, of course, cost money, but it comes back, I think, to the, you know, one of the first questions you asked about the economic impact. And so the reality is that if we can invest in enabling women's participation in the labor market, it comes, as we said, with this $6 billion figure to GDP. But, you know, our report showed trillion, yes, of course, trillion, even more. And so the report estimates that roughly across the globe, 30% of additional salaries, if you will, comes back to governments in terms of tax receipts. So that's a global average.
Yeah.
And so that figure is roughly 1.5 trillion additional tax receipts that could really be channeled and financed to many of these programs we're talking about. And so I think we just have to move away from this notion that childcare, maternity, and paternity protection are costs. They are really investments.
Let's see. I want to just go into the regional and sectoral trends. Can we drill down into some specific regions, and then we'll get to sectors and things. Where are the gender gaps largest? And what's your prognosis for these regions? Why does this gap particularly continue to persist in places like North America and the EU, where you would think that they have policies that have that enabling environment in place?
True. I mean, maybe I can start with the first and turn to Sheena for the issue on North America. I mean, the gaps are really widest in Arab states, Northern Africa, and Southern Asia.
Okay.
And those gaps, I mean, we mentioned at the beginning the global gap in participation of 27%.
Yeah.
In these three regions, the gap exceeds 50 percentage points.
50%?
So nearly double the global average.
It's pretty startling.
Now, the prognosis for these regions, on a positive note perhaps, is that at least out to the forecast period, we anticipate some modest improvements in these three regions.
Yeah.
But the reality is, given the size of the gap, it's not closing nearly as fast as we would like. And in addition to the gaps, I mean, I think it merits mentioning also the levels in these three regions.
Yeah.
And so we know that the global average is around 49% for women to participate.
Right.
So 27 percentage points below that of men. In these regions, the figures are more like 22%. So essentially, between 1/5 and 1/4 of women only are participating in these three regions.
One
So
in 5, 1 in 4, only.
And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done, not only obviously in closing the gap, but making sure that those levels are at really something that would make a significant impact in these
Okay.
regions. And I mean, the reality is, coming back to this economic impact figure,
Yeah.
we see that, not surprisingly,
Yeah.
that the most benefit would be to these three regions where the gaps are the widest.
Okay. All right. How about some of these other regions?
Yes, in regards to Northern America and
Yeah.
the EU, the issue is less about participation. Clearly, it's close to half-half women are participating.
They are.
But the issue is rather when they are participating, they are faced with a set of constraints, whether it's unemployment, but mostly related to work-family balance, work flexibility, access to childcare, parental leave, as well as unequal pay. That's one of the biggest constraints as well in these developed regions.
No, and I think also in developed economies, what we see is there is a certain level of good access, if you will, to the labor market.
Yeah.
But sometimes what happens is, when women exit the labor market temporarily, either to care for a child or an elderly person, certainly in some of the advanced economies, the challenge is then transitioning back
Okay.
and making sure that that enabling environment is there for women to return once they leave temporarily. And so
Right.
there's some evidence to suggest that, certain level of leave, if you're gone too long, you pay a huge penalty to
Yes.
return.
Right.
And so this obviously speaks to some of the incentives about returning. And so I think facilitating that re-access, if you will, I think is an important consideration in some of the developed economies.
Yeah, I want to throw in a few. We're starting to get some questions in from the field, from our viewers. From Letizia, she's saying women are often overrepresented in part-time jobs. How do we measure the share of women who freely chose to work part-time as opposed to the share of women who have to take several part-time jobs to pay the bills? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, statistically, there's a difference in terms of voluntary part-time work and involuntary part-time work. And as well, I know in BLS in the U.S. as well as
BLS?
The Bureau of Labor Statistics
okay.
and the Department of Labor in the U.S. as
Yeah.
well as in Eurostat.
Right.
You'll see that the reasons for part-time work, whether it's voluntary and involuntary, differ.
Okay.
And it is significantly for childcare reasons for women than it is for men. And of course, there's that overrepresentation as well. And I think it's also equally important to encourage that men should also be equally represented in part-time work as well. It shouldn't just be women. And it sort of is a reflection that there's sort of this double burden that women have of childcare as well as being in the paid employment.
No, and I think, thank you, Letitia, for that question. If I could just maybe, only to follow up very briefly, really, is that part-time, involuntary part-time in Europe certainly is nearly twice that of men. And I think more importantly, the incidence of part-time employment among women, Letitia, I think also speaks to some of the sectoral and occupational segregation that we see.
Yeah.
So the reality is that women have difficulty accessing some of the same occupations that men do. Some of those occupations, in fact, whether it be sales or education or social services, are often more associated with part-time employment. And so because of that sectoral segregation that exists, the reality is women are more compelled, not out of choice, but out of what's available in terms of their employment, and thus find themselves, unfortunately, in part-time employment, which speaks again to some of the pay gaps that we see. So the reality is if they're working part-time, even if it's 2 jobs, that they end up earning less than they would.
Yep. No, and I wanted to get into these different sectors of work that we're finding women in. Are they doing better in some sectors than in others? What about different occupations, different jobs? Are women still mostly in service, retail, teaching, men in factory work or managing? And why are they stuck in those sectors if they are, where the wages are traditionally lower, things like retail, garments, healthcare? How do we change it?
I mean, just to answer the question about why we're still here, actually, I was going to say that the sectoral segregation has not improved at all.
Has not improved at all?
In the past 2 decades, it's actually increased by 15%. And that sort of gives insight of like the direction of the future of work for women, but also the reason why it's has not improved is that it's sort of become this self-reinforcing cycle in terms of we see certain occupations for women, let's say culturally, or for men, and that also kind of shifts the decisions a lot of women make in terms of the education they decide to invest in, or the type of skills they decide to invest in. So that's
that the women decide to invest in, or the society?
Well, I would have to say that the women are constrained to make these decisions.
Okay.
Rather, they see that seeing the labor market conditions, well, it's they're limited by choices, perhaps, or it's
but
just
not necessarily by their skill levels.
No, I'm not at all by their inherent ability. Absolutely not. Of course not.
Yeah, and I think maybe only quickly in terms of what we can do to sort of break down some of these glass walls, if you will, is, of course, there's a lot of things we can do in the workplace in terms of making sure that women are equally represented on corporate boards, something which is a particular initiative in my home country of Canada. But also there are some preventative measures that we can take in terms of ensuring the equal access to education and the types of education that individuals, men and women, can freely choose to study. And that, I think, can at least start that process of women
equalizing things.
And I mean, one really good example is promoting women's entrepreneurship. A lot of women in different countries face a lot of structural barriers in terms of just starting a business. And for women, there are an extra set of barriers, whether it's administrative or accessing resources or networks, or access to finance or financial literacy or digital skills. It's a really good case study of how we can address this issue.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, when you talk about starting businesses, I always think to myself, it's a pretty big challenge anyway, for whatever you are, to start a business. So, given the sort of environments that women have to operate in, it's doubly
I think some of the economic evidence, though, would point to the fact that women who are managers or head of companies, in fact, are more productive. And actually contribute more, at least economically, in terms of benefits to society.
I want to move on to a slightly different area, especially because Marina is bringing it up. When we talk about work-life balance, do you think that there is a need to minimize working hours? You may highlight flexi hours, but this is not helping considering school timings. So, I mean, if we want to talk about work-life balance a bit, and I mean, I suppose the occupations that women tend to choose means that they have to balance family, care work. You talk a lot about, you had contributing family workers, they tend to be. I wanted to get into that a little bit. There's a category that you call own account or contributing family workers. I wanted to know what the difference was between the two. They're mostly women, I guess, and maybe to go into invisible work as well.
Sure.
Because I think this all has some bearing on work-life balance.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just on the first point with respect to the question that came really is, this notion of flexibility. And flexibility is certainly something that was talked about considerably in the morning session of the summit. And, it's certainly not about flexibilizing the labor market in a sense of ensuring access for women. It's really more about flexible work arrangements that allow men and women to sort of balance work on the one hand and then private life, family responsibilities, etc. on the other. So it's important to note that it's not just about flexibility
Yeah.
in and of itself as a goal.
It's about making the workplace more flexible, like job sharing, giving time that, hours and things that work for other parts of your life.
Well, that's certainly
So,
one
yeah.
one aspect. Yes.
Did you want to?
Yeah, regarding your question about invisible work.
Yeah.
I mean, invisible work is really unpaid care work. A lot of the work that women do goes unnoticed and unaccounted for in national statistics. And because as a result of that, it's undervalued and under-recognized. What unpaid care work is basically social reproduction, whether it's our health, whether it's our cognitive skills, whether it's our physical abilities. I mean, we're all here because someone had to care for us.
Yes.
And someone has to care for someone to go to school, participate in the labor force. And these are crucial contributions to the economy that goes unaccounted for. And some of the ways governments, I mean, it is happening now, but some of the ways governments can address this is by actually taking concrete action in measuring and valuing unpaid care work.
This was something curious to me. I was wondering, because your report, you essentially say that we need to put a value on care work, on invisible work. And how do you do that? I mean, how do you measure the value of caring for your family or caring for your loved ones? How do you do that?
I mean, there are a wide range of statistical methods of doing it, but usually the first start is doing household time use surveys and just really tracking the time women do in their working day, in their entire days on different paid and unpaid activities. That's one way, and as well as there's this. Statistically, we can sort of compute the contribution women make at home, like how much would that cost, let's say, if she were to hire another person who is well paid in the care industry, whether that's healthcare or childcare, and there's sort of that compensation effect, and that could be accounted for.
I mean, it's also, I mean, it's really about also recognition. I mean, if I could even make this a little bit personal to some extent, my 101-year-old grandmother, who's probably not watching now, is looked after by her 74-year-old daughter. Now, the reality is that care is unpaid.
Right.
It's unrecognized in statistics. But there are certain programs, and this is certainly happening in some countries, where they are giving even a notional amount of money per month to caregivers that have been assessed as looking after whether or not it's a child or an elderly person full-time. And I think certainly in my own personal case, that recognition to my grandmother's daughter, my aunt, gives her a sense of responsibility and respect, and it means something to her. And of course it needs to be adequately paid, but I mean, to be completely honest, it's just that recognition to say, I'm being given something for that, and that is cannot be measured in some sense. I mean, okay, we try to measure it, but
of course,
the value it brings that individual, just a notional amount, is really, I think, very important. I think in the context of population aging, this notion of how we respect and value care must change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is sort of what we're talking about when we talk about decent work and the dignity that work instills in everybody, and the fact that we do need to value every kind of work that is being done,
paid or otherwise.
Paid or otherwise. I just want to remind everybody who's watching us on Facebook to send in your questions. We're getting a lot of them coming in now, and I'm here with Stephen Tobin, Sheena Yoon, who are ILO economists, who are talking about the global trends in the world of work and women. Let's see. Let's go to Dia, who sent in a question. It says, it's often feared that expanding maternity protections, such as making maternity leave longer, could penalize women by making them harder to hire. How do we remedy that, particularly in developing countries?
Well, I'd have to say the ILO Convention on maternity leave it gives the minimum standard is 14 weeks. There have been case studies that a very long period of time, I believe, there are negative repercussions or penalties. But in regards to To the penalties women face and preventing that, I mean, I'd have to say it's a mixture of the right policy. Now that there are a wide range of literature that shows different studies of the optimal sort of amount of time of leave, as well as making sure there are legal mechanisms that mothers are not discriminated against. There should be no penalty for having a family. There should be no penalty for being a mother.
Yeah. It goes back to sort of the balance of care and care work and etc. Another one, this one from Ranjita. Many of the structural norms are sometimes camouflaged as traditional and traditionally accepted. How can governmental and non-governmental agencies, especially in developing economies, be convinced to be on board despite these traditional notions to ensure an enabling environment for women? So we're going into the sort of cultural constraints, societal constraints.
Yeah.
What can we do there?
Well, many things. First, I'd have to say there are a lot of I'd say normative setting powers, more or less, saying that policies can affect norms. And I realize also norms affect policies. But really, if there is a policy that equally recognizes women and their contribution to society, there will be sort of these multiplier effects within society and change norms. And likewise, norms can be addressed through very targeted initiatives on changing our perception, whether it's at a community level or a society level, just even media campaigns. These have enormous effects in terms of how we define masculinity, femininity, engaging men into the household. That should be seen as something positive, not negative or defeminizing.
No, and I think we also have to come back to this notion of really highlighting the fact that many of these women would prefer to be in paid employment. And I think even some of the evidence from the Gallup and ILO survey also points to the fact that the majority of men also support this. So I think it's also, it's an educational thing. And so I think we just need to realize that, okay, we've talked much about the business case also at the summit, but, it's also this human right that there are aspirations that should be filled. And, this is a democratization of an issue that needs to be raised.
Another one from Dia. In societies that are socially highly stratified, how much do variables like caste, ethnicity, race play a role in enabling women access opportunities? So, I mean, people are very interested in all these kind of societal, cultural constraints. Did you have any figures, or were you able to sort of parse out data about these sort of things?
I mean, not regarding caste or
no.
These other,
race, caste, ethnicity.
No, but we did have,
other factors.
I mean, there are factors regarding youth. We know youth youth women face the largest gender gaps.
Young women,
And it's the toughest for them. But I mean, I have to recognize, of course, women who are minorities, indigenous, migrant, of different caste, these gender gaps are even more exacerbated for them.
Okay. It was actually, while we're on constraints, you at one point you were talking about, I think, really basic things that surprised me, like access to transportation, things like that.
So this is the structural constraint. I mean, we see this again and again in developing countries. Even the basic access to transportation, but also safe transportation.
Safe transportation.
Right, safe transportation. Because I think how transportation affects men and women may differ depending on the region. But even this basic access limits women from participating.
Okay. How about the future of work for women and some policies around that? What should be at the forefront of the policy dialogue today in terms of targeting or narrowing the gender gaps? How do we target that desire to narrow the gaps, and how does the reality today inform us about the future of work for women? What do you guys expect in the coming decade?
Right.
I mean, there's many issues I think that we could touch upon with respect to the future
with one
of
or
work,
two.
but I mean, I think certainly the first one is, as I mentioned in the opening, that looking ahead, to the next century of the ILO, that population is aging and the labor force growth is slowing. And certainly the ability to bring women into the labor market will be an important contribution to sort of addressing that slowdown in growth. And that's, I think, an important consideration. This is also for older workers as well, but certainly women. The second thing we want to note is this occupational and sectoral segregation, which has worsened. And certainly in the last 2 decades, when technological change was changing rapidly. And so one concern certainly we have is that in this gig economy, in this AI world where things are going to at least likely change faster than they did before, that there is a risk that this occupational and sectoral segregation
Could really just
could
get worse.
get worse.
Yeah.
And so this speaks again to some sort of the preventative measures we've talked about, certainly in terms of skills and education at an early age. And I think speaking on that, though, in terms of skills and technological change, the reality is that a lot of the women outside the labor market have high education, have high skills, and therefore can contribute very much to this future of the world of work. And so we need to think about leveraging that potential as we move forward into a new world of work, if you will.
Did you want to add anything?
Just to emphasize that, I mean, policies that governments can make a concerted effort to make make it conducive for women to work, to participate, whether that's parental leave policy for both men and women, whether that's flexible work arrangements, whether that's childcare facilities nearby, social protection. A lot of these can make huge efforts just making the work life more conducive for a woman to balance family and work.
Before I bring this to a close, I just want to ask each of you, what was the most surprising thing you found in your research and exploring all both the survey and then putting the data against it? What really shocked you? What really surprised you?
I think what really shocked me, I think in the first instance would be this, that the social norms and the socioeconomic constraints are almost of equal value in terms of explaining the lower participation rates among women. And if anything, what we find in our report is that even some of the socio-economic constraints that we see, whether or not it's lack of safe transportation, underlying that are norms that are not conducive really to female participation in the labor market. And so that I think was one of the key things that I certainly was surprised by.
Yes. I mean, similarly as well, but also I found it very surprising that these gaps continue to persist. Or
I think you're progress joined by a lot of people who are sending in questions.
The progress is glacial, even though a majority of women and men agree that women should be able to work in the labor force.
So why are we frozen here? Why aren't we moving faster?
Well, I think the second sort of surprising point that I would bring is that far too often I think we've thought about how addressing these barriers, whether it's transportation or adequate childcare, as costs. And we really need a cultural shift in how we think about that. And these things are really investments that can pay dividends not only to the economy as a whole, but for the women really around the world who would prefer to be in a paid job. And I think thinking about these things as investments rather than costs, even during times of low economic growth, I think is an important consideration.
To think of the value of work that matters, that's good.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to have to bring this to a close. I'm afraid there's still a lot of other questions, but you can find out more about everything we've talked about today on our website. That's www.ilo.org, and you can follow us on Twitter at ILO, at the hashtag ILO. And I'd like to thank Stephen Tobin, Sheena Yoon for joining me today. And I'd like to thank all of you on Facebook for sending in your questions. And goodbye for now from Geneva. We'll see you again soon.